Good afternoon. This afternoon, it's a joy to introduce a longtime colleague of mine, Dr. Bruce Clary. This is Bruce's 30th year at McPherson College. He is one of those very talented individuals who has worked in a broad number of arenas, and I will attempt to name a few, but probably will not cover all. He began his work at the college in the area of advancement, and specifically with responsibility for alumni, has been a long-time professor in the areas of English and journalism, has been advisor for The Spectator, exhibits a great deal of passion for McPherson College. And as many of you know, Bruce has a great deal of expertise when it comes to the work of Emily Dickinson. She was the subject of his doctoral dissertation work at Kansas State University. So without further ado, Bruce, welcome, and thank you.
Well, thank you, Steve. Sounds like the audio's working just like it should. That was a very kind introduction. I certainly didn't expect anything quite so formal as, introductions and all of those sorts of things. But I'd like to welcome you all today. Truly, there's probably nothing, no one that I enjoy talking about more than Emily Dickinson. And it's a lot more fun when it's a dialogue, it's a back and forth with somebody else who's reading and interested in Dickinson. I'll try not to make this entirely a one-way conversation that we have today. Steve did a nice job of introducing me, and I think there really are very few in the room who don't know me, but I did do my dissertation on Dickinson back in I guess I finally finished it in 1998. I started it in 1990. And every other year, I get to spend 3 days on Dickinson in my American Literature 2 class. And so, it's not very often, not very much that one gets to spend time with a writer that has meant so much to me. But that's the nature of what we do at McPherson. We don't have the opportunities to offer those really in-depth specialized courses. This is Emily. This is the only single confirmed photo that we have of Emily Dickinson, although I'm going to show you another one in a moment. She was 16 years old when this photo was taken, and it's a photo that's really had a lot of influence on the way we have, I think, tried to understand who Emily Dickinson might have been. She looks rather frail, sickly. That's led some people to think that maybe Dickinson was anorexic. Certainly, probably most of you know that she was a recluse for the last 25 years of her life, and so people have diagnosed her as an agoraphobe and those sorts of things. But interesting, a fear of the marketplace. In other words, just fear of being in public. Yeah, good. In 2010, this photo surfaced, and the woman on the right there, on my right, on the right of the seating, is probably about 99% sure that this is Emily Dickinson when she is 29 years old. Her facial features, her eyes, everything about her have been computer analyzed and compared to the other photo that we have. And those who do that kind of expert identification work say that they're about 98 or 99% certain that this is Dickinson about 12 years after that other picture. The woman on her left is a friend, and we have her positively identified. There's no doubt that this is a friend of Emily Dickinson's. Her name was Kate Anton, perhaps Kate Scott at the time this picture was taken. And that's one of the reasons. Her husband has previously died. You can see that she's dressed in mourning. And so the fact that this is a known friend of Emily Dickinson's who's appropriately dressed in black at a time that she would have been in mourning makes us really pretty darn certain that this is our second photo of Dickinson. And you can see that it gives us a very different impression of the more mature woman after the only surviving photo that we had until 2010. No one's really going out on a limb and saying 100% that this is Emily Dickinson, but I tend to think it is, especially when you have a chance to look deeply into those eyes. You begin to recognize that this must be the same woman. Well, I wanted us to get a little bit reacquainted with Emily today. So obviously, we want to explore some poems, and I've chosen the poems about faith and doubt. I thought that would be appropriate for the audience that we have here at the Cedars, but it's also one of the most common topics that Dickinson wrote about. She was especially concerned with immortality and whether life after death really existed or not, and she called immortality her flood subject. She spent much time thinking about it, and so we've got some of those poems to look at today. But probably our discussion here will focus more on the ideas that we see. As we see Emily struggling with these questions of faith and doubt. But the real power of Emily Dickinson is in the way that she uses language and the way that she uses words. And we won't probably have nearly enough time to do that, but maybe as we read through some of the poems, that will come through to you. The very unique way that she has of using the English language just makes it seem so fresh and new to us. You really have to get involved in making your own meaning out of an Emily Dickinson poem. And she encourages us to do that by sort of introducing some obscurities and eccentricities into her language. So it's quiz time here. If you don't have a cell phone or if you don't know how to send a text message, don't worry about it. But if you have a cell phone, go ahead and take it out and go ahead and put it on silence, because if you follow through with my instructions here, we're all going to be getting a text message back here, and that'll mean all kind of beep, beep, boop, boop, beep, beep, boop, boop. That's what happens in my classroom. Okay, so here we go. Just a little pre-knowledge check, all right? And so if you think that Emily Dickinson, notice I didn't tell you earlier when we were talking about how old she was, what dates those photos were taken. Some of you paid really close attention to her dress, I'm sure. So if you think Emily Dickinson lived from 1650 to 1705, put a 1 after, you put a space after that code number that you put in, and then the number that you see adjacent to your answer. So 1788 to 1835, 1830 to 1886, or 1890 to 1953. Okay? Now the rest of you will come back for a show of hands in a minute. All right? All right. Second little pre-knowledge question here. What do you know about Emily? How many poems did Emily Dickinson publish in her lifetime? If you think she published 0 poems in her lifetime, you would put in 5. If you think she published 11, it would be 6. If you think 701, that would be 7. Or 1,789, put in an 8 for your answer.
There's a difference between writing and publishing.
Oh, yes. Yes, I do mean publishing. Yes. Mm-hmm. In print for an audience. And then finally, Emily's religious background, her upbringing, was in which faith tradition? Was she Catholic? That would be 9. Do you think she was Congregationalist, that is of Puritan orientation, Anabaptist, or Methodist? All right, those would be your answers. Okay? So those of you who are my little guinea pigs here and showing us how this thing works, you can hit send now. All right? And the number that you're going to send it to, you can see right up there. When you hit send, you're going to need a number, of course. It's going to go to 37607. So one person has been successful in this. Now you can understand when I have a room full of 18 and 19-year-olds, of course, we get pretty much 100% participation in something like this. And it's a real good way to begin to get students engaged with the material, and gives me a good idea of what they might know or not know or remember from the last class session or not remember, what we might need to cover a little bit more. This is a little technique that I use, maybe once a week or so in most of my classes. So we'll just go with a show of hands. How many agree with our one respondent up here? Oh, we've got two respondents who both agree. So you can see down at the bottom now we've got total results 2. So great. 2 of us managed to successfully navigate the waters there. 1836 to 1886. Okay, all right. Did anybody want to go for the earlier dates? Or 1890 to 1953? Everyone knows that that's much too late for Emily. Yeah, 1830 to 1886 are the right dates for Emily, and we'll have more to say about that in just a moment. Our second question was how many poems did Emily Dickinson publish in her lifetime? And we've got a split here between these two extremes. We've got someone who says none, and another respondent who chose 1,789. Anybody agree with none? How many hands for none? She published no poems in her lifetime. Well, we've got half a dozen or so. 11. How many are going to vote for 11? Got a couple. 701, is that going to get quite a few? Okay, that tends to be our biggest response. 1,789. Anybody want to agree with that one? Okay. Well, you folks who say 1,789, that's the number of extant Emily Dickinson poems that we have, all right? We've recovered a total of 1,789. And in the recent most authoritative edition of Dickinson's works, this is how many poems are included. She published 11 poems in her lifetime. All of those were without her name attached. A couple of the poems were published either against her wishes or without her knowledge. What Dickinson did was she corresponded heavily with people all throughout her lifetime. She had a huge number of correspondents, and she sent them poems, and she would write poems and send them to the neighbors with a little bouquet of flowers or a loaf of bread or any number of things. She was quite a baker, and some of these poems were taken by her friends and published in little local newspapers, basically. So 11 poems in her lifetime. And the last question here was about her faith tradition, and we've got a division between Congregationalist and Methodist. Anybody going to go with Catholic? Okay, good. Congregationalist, any more show of hands there? All right, we've got a good number of hands going up. No one went for Anabaptist, huh? You'd think we might know about her, right? Right? Seen a few messenger articles or something if she'd been Anabaptist. And then finally, Methodist. Anybody else with Methodist? Got a few. Well, it is Congregationalist. I mean, Amherst, Massachusetts. I mean, she's in the heart of New England and Puritan territory, and so her background is Congregationalist. And Emily never joined the church. All right, she was under a great deal of pressure to do so at one point in her life, but she did not ever officially join. So let's just talk for just a moment about each of those 3 questions here a little bit more. So Emily Dickinson's lifetime. 1830 to 1885. Actually, she dies in 1886 at 55 years old. Her birthday's very late in the year, in December. So, two really big events in Emily Dickinson's lifetime. And one, of course, is the American Civil War. And that's right at the time that she's at the very height of her poetic powers. She's writing somewhere between 200 and 400 poems a year between 1862 and 1865. So a big bulk of her output, as we have it, all compressed into those 4 years of the American Civil War. But the other thing that's really significant, of course, for Dickinson's questions regarding her faith and her beliefs had to do with the publication of The Origin of the Species in 1859. Again, right at the time that she is coming into her poetic power. So again, we'll have a little bit more to say about that. I mean, what are we talking about here? We're talking about at the time that she was born, the notion that God created the universe and the cosmos is absolutely taken for granted. Design is considered to be all the evidence that one needs to support the Bible. But by the time she's at the height of her poetic powers, now all of these questions are beginning to be raised about the story that's been accepted unquestioned for hundreds of years. That second question about how many poems did she publish? Emily Dickinson desired to publish at one point in her life. She wrote a series of 5 letters to a fellow by the name of Thomas Wentworth Higginson in 1862. Higginson had just published an article in Atlantic Monthly, which was a brand new publication at that time, only been a year or two old, but she was already a faithful reader of Atlantic Monthly. And Higginson had published an article about new poets, and she sent him 5 of her poems in her first letter, and she asked him in her own cryptic way whether he thought her poems breathed or not. And he sent back a not necessarily gentle letter, which told her that he thought maybe she wasn't quite ready to have any of her work published. Well, it didn't keep Dickinson from establishing a lifelong relationship with Higginson. In fact, Dickinson allowed Higginson to visit her in 1868, and his recollections, his record of that visit with her over a period of 2 days is one of the most important records that we have of what Dickinson was like in her maturity. But Dickinson essentially became a private poet. She is absolutely unique in the history of American letters, and as far as I know, in almost any literature anywhere. Here, can you think of an artist? Can you think of a writer who was not known during her lifetime, all right, for being a writer, who became the most important poet that this country has produced in, our 250-year history or more? Okay? That's really extraordinary, that you had a woman who was writing entirely for herself, entirely keeping everything privately. She bound them in these little booklets that were called fascicles. They were called that after her death. We don't know what she called them. But you can see that she just stacked stationery on top and then punched some pinholes in them and threaded some thread through them and made her own little manuscript booklets. And that's what her sister Lavinia discovered in her bureau dresser drawer after Dickinson died in May of 1886. It took 4 years for her sister Lavinia to find somebody to edit those poems and finally get them published. Higginson, by the way, was co-editor of the first 2 volumes of Emily Dickinson's poems. They didn't expect anything out of the publication of the first edition, and it sold through 11 printings in a year. So they very, very quickly put together a second edition. They loved her poems. The poems were much edited, of course, because they were so unorthodox and eccentric in their style. But she really hit a nerve with her readers. People loved what they read of Emily. And then finally, yes, she's a Congregationalist, Puritan background. I put this picture in. This is still the current First Congregational Church of Amherst, built in 1868. Dickinson's brother Austin was the overseer of the construction of this church. And by 1861, 1862, Dickinson very rarely left the house. Certainly within a couple of more years from then, we think that she probably never left the grounds of her home, except to go see the church when it was finished. She sneaked out at night to go see the church by moonlight that her brother had helped oversee the construction of. And as far as we know, that was the last time that she left the family grounds. And so for another 17, 18 years thereabouts, she remained at home. There are wonderful stories. Mabel Loomis Todd, who was a neighbor who moved into the neighborhood about 5 years before Dickinson died, became Austin's lover and the other co-editor of the first 2 editions of her poems, has a wonderful description of how she went to the Dickinson home, and she would play the piano down at the bottom of the stairs. She knew that Emily would be up at the top of the stairs listening. They had a wonderful correspondence and a friendship, but she never saw her face until she saw her in the casket. So, how Dickinson wrote. It's pretty hard to put together how Dickinson did write her poems, but from memoirs of family members and so on, we think it was pretty spontaneous. She carried around little scraps of paper, whatever little scraps of paper they had. Of course, that was paper was an important and rather expensive commodity at that time. She spent, by the way, good money on that stationery that she copied her poems onto for her little manuscript booklets. But any little flap of an envelope or a sack from a grocer or whatever, she carried around in her apron pockets. And her nieces have written memories of her just stopping and writing something suddenly on the windowsill on some of these little scraps of paper that she kept with her. And then what we assume that she did was that she went up to her room at night and she took those scraps out and worked on them and began to transcribe them into her little booklets. She wrote in traditional forms, all right, although you have to understand that she took a lot of liberties with those traditional forms. Her favorite form is just a standard hymn meter, quatrains of 8/6/8/6 in iambic pentameter. And so you'll see that over and over again, although you'll see variations on it. She never titled her poems. So we've got 1,789 untitled poems. That's why on the handout that you have there, I've given you the numbers of the 2 major editions that are used. The first number is the Franklin number, and Ralph W. Franklin is the one who managed to put the manuscript booklets back together. So his numbering is the most recent and the most authoritative. It's much more chronological than Thomas H. Johnson's numbers. But I've given you those numbers as well because that edition of the complete poems of Emily Dickinson is still very, very plentiful. And many, many times the poems that you will read and buy, even in a selected edition of Dickinson's poems, will carry the Johnson numbers as opposed to the Franklin numbers. Finally, variants. Dickinson kept footnotes on her poems. I brought my facsimiles of the manuscript booklets. If any you were interested enough afterwards to want to take a look at those, she'd mark the words in her fair copies, all right? She'd have a fair copy up at the top, and then she'd maybe put a little cross or an asterisk or something like that, and she'd put down all of the different alternatives that she thought might work in that particular place. She never made any final selections, all right? So to give you one extreme example, there's a poem by the name of Those Fair Fictitious People, maybe 12 lines or so. There are 17 different variants in it. If you take that and multiply that out, all of the different possible combinations, if you take every possible variant possibility there could be somewhere around 4,500 different poems, all right, depending on how you put the variants together into it. So that's another thing that always has to be in your mind when you're working with Emily. Most of the editions that you have won't have the variants. They'll just give you what the fair copy was, and many times that's Johnson or Franklin's notion of what the best choices were. And we were never really working with Emily's final choices, because she didn't. If she'd ever put them in print, right, if she'd ever published, she would have made some of those kinds of decisions that would have been more final. Her conventions, spelling, punctuation, capitalization, very eccentric, all right? In fact, that's one of the first things that usually strikes people about Dickinson is the way they strike the eye, right? And just the way that they look on the page with all of the dashes and the seemingly arbitrary punctuation and so on. Dickinson's poetry is extremely compressed. One of the things that I have my students do when we're studying Dickinson is to go ahead and fill in all the missing words, all right? There's the garbled grammar, there's the scrambled syntax. It's, can you take what you see here and turn it into a standard English sentence, subject, verb, object, order, all right? Get it all together and with the correct grammar. When I say garbled grammar, yeah, you'll see subject-verb agreement problems in Dickinson. In uninflected verbs, she really chose not to inflect her verbs for whatever reason, many times. So you see a lot of things that just puzzle you about why would she have done that? And, maybe because she was simply writing for herself. She gave up on the possibility that she would ever be published. And so maybe that's the explanation. If it's for me, I can write it any way I want. I think it has a lot more to do with these final two, however. Again, I've told you that it's the language that is so powerful in Dickinson. And so when you read Dickinson, you are really engaged in becoming a co-creator of the poem along with her. And it's the way that she has of really making us pay attention to the language. She makes it new every time around. Well, on to the questions of faith and doubt in some of these poems. My hope was that we might get through. There's a horizontal line, I think, at the end of one of the columns of poems, maybe the third column of poems that I've given you there, and I thought it would be ambitious for us to get through all of those. But I wanted you to have some others that you could take home, or I know some of you had a chance to look through them and read them earlier on, that you might have questions about that we could finish up with. And I'm going to give you all a chance to, at your tables, come to some reading of a little brief poem of Dickinson's. Otis Phillips Lord was actually a fellow that Emily Dickinson was engaged to marry late in her life. In 1882, she would have been 51, 52 years old. And she wrote to him this in a letter, which I think is really indicative of what we find in all of Dickinson's poems on these particular subjects. So, on subjects of which we know nothing, or should I say beings, and I think by beings she means God, Christ, right? Not just subjects of immortality and the truth of the Christian story, but belief in God. We both believe and disbelieve 100 times an hour, which keeps believing nimble, right? So what what really characterizes Dickinson's poem, and the second poem that I have on the list, of course, is the one from which I took the title. And Dickinson has a great sense that faith really is something about which we can never be certain. A doubt is actually an essential part of faith. If you don't have something there that's uncertain about it, then it's not faith, right? It doesn't take that leap. So here's a poem. This gets us back to. I thought I would start with this one simply because I think it summarizes so well the impact that Darwin and the burgeoning theory of evolution, as it became more and more widespread during her lifetime, had on her. She wrote, and this is a late poem too. This is about 1882, about the same time as that letter that we just saw. Those dying then knew where they went. They went to God's right hand. That hand is amputated now, and God cannot be found. The abdication of belief makes the behavior small. Better an ignis fatuus than no illum at all. And a dictionary is a good thing to have on hand, or an encyclopedia is a good thing to have on hand when you're reading Dickinson as well. Some of you know what an ignis fatuus is, right? Right? No? Swamp gas, right? When there's almost a supernatural-like light that rises up out of the swamps. Sailors sometimes see them at sea as well. So better something that's really not there at all, and that's an illusion, than nothing, right? It's a good indication, I think, here. The abdication of belief makes the behavior small. Dickinson struggled with her own faith and beliefs all of her life. She never gave up on faith entirely, and right here she shows how important that she thinks it is, that one not do that. If you give it up, it makes the behavior small, right? We become less. There's less to hold us accountable, maybe, is one way to think of that. And so it's a good example of what's happened in her lifetime, all right? You might read that first line like, back when I was a girl, right? We all knew that we were going to heaven after our death. But that concept of heaven, of eternal life, is really called into question now. That hand of God's right hand, where we're all supposed to sit at the banquet, has been amputated now. And one could, point a finger at those scientists for making that happen, but we won't do that. This, I think, is Dickinson's poems vary a lot in quality. I don't think that last poem's a particularly good poem of Dickinson's. There are so many really, truly brilliant ones. And I think this is one of her best ones on faith. It's one that's not really very well known, actually. Faith is the Pierless bridge. So that's Pierless, right? That means the bridge without any visible means of support. There are no piers underneath it holding it up. But she's also punning on Pierless, P-E-R-L-E-S-S, right? The incomparable bridge. Supporting what we see unto the seen that we do not. So the seen that we do not is whatever's behind that cloud of unknowing, right? That's still there for us to find our way through. Too slender for the eye, it bears the soul as bold as it were rocked in steel, with arms of steel at either side. It joins behind the veil. To what could we presume the bridge would cease to be to our far vacillating feet a first necessity? So the bridge has no visible means of support, right? Yet it's rock solid. It's so slender that we can, We can't see it. We can't imagine anybody being able to stand on it. And what makes it all work is the fact that we don't know what's on the other side of that veil. We don't know what's behind that. That's what faith is. Faith is believing without that knowing and without that proof. If we knew, right? If we could presume what was behind that veil, it wouldn't be necessary. We wouldn't need faith anymore. And I think that that's the main equation of most of Dickinson's thought on this. Don't you like that poem? Isn't that a wonderful piece?
After you describe should that be T-O-O, or it was written to?
No, I'm pretty sure. I do have one typo on the handout that I gave you, but yes, right, the very first poem, in fact, because it was a late edition that I decided to put it in there. But I'm pretty sure I've gone through and I've double-checked these texts. So again, you will see lots of what appears to be poetic. Yeah, if you want to call it poetic license, and we'll all agree on that. Yeah. Veil, for example, is not the spelling that we would typically expect there, right? We'd expect V-E-I-L, perhaps.
Well, this is contrast with what we sometimes think about faith. Don't we sometimes think of faith as a bridge to some degree of certainty?
Sure, yeah.
That's the bridge.
And yeah.
Oh, that faith becomes a bridge to certainty in our minds.
Yeah, but we don't really know.
That's true.
We don't really know. And that's what she's saying. So maybe sometimes you hear people try to draw a distinction between belief and faith. You know, and the belief is the kind of thing that's founded on evidence. Faith is the kind of thing that's founded on. How does Hebrews put it? Faith is the substance of things hoped for and evidence of things not seen. I'm garbling that, I'm sure, but that's kind of close, right? Well, part of Emily Dickinson's life experience with faith and the church was simply her own discomfort and final rejection of Orthodox Christianity, of the institutional church. This is probably one of her best-known poems. I'm guessing that a vast majority of you here in the room have seen this poem at some time or another. Some keep the Sabbath going to church. Puts her in the category of the romantics who find God revealed through nature, right? Some keep the Sabbath going to church. I keep it staying at home, with bobolink for a chorister and an orchard for a dome. Some keep the Sabbath in surplice. I just wear my wings, and instead of tolling the bell for church, our little sexton sings. God preaches, a noted clergyman, and the sermon is never long. So instead of getting to heaven at last, I'm going all along.
I wonder what she meant by a little sexton. It must be a bird.
Yeah, sure, a bird. Yeah, a little sexton sings. Yeah, those of you who know some theological language, might see something that resembles realized eschatology in this poem, right? That we don't have to wait till death to experience heaven and the divine. It's right here. It's right now, right? God has answered the Lord's prayer, brought the kingdom to earth. There are hundreds of these poems, right, that on faith and doubt that fit into, say, something about religious belief. The most common pattern that I find in these poems is the kind of pattern that one sees in this poem, where Dickinson starts out with what seems to be a very firm statement of belief and faith. All right? There's not much doubt in a statement like, this world is not conclusion. A species stands beyond, invisible as music, but positive as sound. Right? Sounds like she's pretty darn certain of everything, right? It beckons and it baffles. Philosophy don't know, and through a riddle at the last sagacity must go. To guess it puzzles scholars, to gain it men have borne contempt of generations and crucifixion shown. Faith slips and laughs and rallies, blushes if any see, plucks at a twig of evidence and asks of vain the way. Much gesture from the pulpit, strong hallelujahs roll. Narcotics cannot still the tooth that nibbles at the soul. That movement from certainty to doubt by the time that we get to the end, where they've always got that. You know, she says narcotics cannot still the tooth that nibbles at the soul. I don't know what you get as, the other part of that metaphor there, like a little rat, like a little mouse, right? That's in there nibbling away, nibbling away at our heart and at our soul. And notice a little dig at Orthodox institutional Christianity there. We've got all these gesturing and strong hallelujahs rolling from the pulpits, right? Doesn't help quell any of those questions that come up. And notice the importance of trying not to let anybody know, all right? Don't want anybody to see my faith slip, right? I blush if anybody sees that. I'll look for anything to try to buck myself up. There's occasional anger at God in Emily Dickinson. She especially took, for someone who avoided public face-to-face encounters, she was very attached to people. In fact, my favorite theory about why she was reclusive was simply because she was so sensitive to her relationships with people, so hypersensitive to those, that it was just too painful for her to really be into direct contact with human beings. And so all of these letters that she would write and all of these gifts that she would send. So when she had friends who died, she took it really personally. God is coming and taking away my friends. And what kind of a God does this? Well, here's a poem that perhaps gets at some of that anger. It certainly tells us a little bit about her belief or lack of belief in original sin doctrine. Of God we ask one favor, that we may be forgiven. For what he's presumed to know, the crime from us is hidden. Immured the whole of life within a magic prison, we reprimand the happiness that too competes with heaven. So we've got all of these things to love and enjoy about our earthly life. And yet what one keeps hearing, again, maybe this is a dig at institutional Christianity more than anything else, right? And traditional theology, original sin theology. We're all, what are these sins that we've committed for which we have to be forgiven? The crime from us is hidden. And so we go about feeling guilty and not enjoying all the magic and the happiness that's available to us right here.
Especially in that era, I think there were many rules and regulations in the congregational and other churches, what you could not do on Sunday and these various, many other rules and regulations.
Yeah.
It could be...
Sure, more than we're accustomed to.
Perhaps, yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right. So,
A lot of things about the Congregational church had really loosened up in the last 200 years. For example, one of the reasons probably why Dickinson never joined the church was because of the faith relation that was still required in the Congregational church, but which wasn't nearly as extensive as what was required in the 17th century to become a member of the church. They had extensive 10-point, we would call them faith journeys, right? Relations of how we had been saved. And that was required. You got up in front of the church and you had to go through that, and the elders sat in the back with their little checklist and made sure you were covering all the basics there. Much of that had gone away by Dickinson's time, but there was still the expectation that they get up and give a little faith testimony. And she could never make herself do that. Here's one of those poems that gets a little bit more angry with God. And notice once again, starting with the sort of the declaration that seems firm in her confidence and her belief. I know that he exists somewhere in silence. He has hid his rare life from our gross eyes. 'Tis an instant's play, 'tis a fond ambush, just to make bliss earn her own surprise. But should the play prove piercing earnest, should the glee glaze in death's stiff stare, would not the fun look too expensive? Would not the jest have crawled too far? So this notion of, God always, we can't ever put our arms around it. We can't ever make sure that he's actually there. What's all of this stuff about hiding all the time from us, right? God, come out and show us your face, right? It's like a game that God plays with the human race just to make bliss earn her own surprise, right? So that somehow we'll have maybe some kind of an ecstatic experience with God, But here's what happens too often, maybe, right? No one ever finds God. And they die. And they never find him. That's a pretty dangerous game for God to play, Dickinson says, right? That's a pretty expensive game. The human race ends up paying dearly for that game that God plays with us. The jest has crawled just a little bit too far. Some people might think that poem's a bit blasphemous. All right, so here's the poem. Here we are, 5 till 3, wrapping up. Again, another one of her very well-known poems, right? I bet many of you have seen this one before. 4 lines, simple little quatrain. And what I want you to do at your tables, what I ask my students to do oftentimes is in a group, everybody take 1 line, all right? So just assign a line around the table, and everybody talks about that line. Focus on the important words there, focus on everything that you see there in that line. For example, you've got the quotation marks around faith. So whoever's got line 1 needs to tell us what they think about that. So we want to see what the poem means at your table, all right? What does the poem mean at your table? Faith is a fine invention when gentlemen can see, but microscopes are prudent in an emergency. Okay, go to it. I'll give you all of 3 minutes to figure this out. Not that there's an answer, right? I say figure it out. There's not an answer. That's the beauty of poetry, right? I hope every table has a different reading of the poem. All right? Okay. Somebody at every table who's willing to tell us what the group makes of this?
We all kind of agreed, I think, that everyday living, you go along and you think you have faith, okay? And everything's fine. But then an emergency, something happens in your life. And that simple faith is not enough. You've got to dig a little deeper.
Okay.
Something more than just the simple.
Something more than yourself.
Yes, more than
Maxine
yourself.
says.
Yes.
Okay. So the mic. Oh, I guess I've got my own, don't I? No, I'm going to let other tables go. Who's going to talk here? Let's hear what.
We wondered whether faith is an invention to get you through the tough spots. And the second line, when gentlemen can see, implies that sometimes we can't see.
Hmm?
That's all the farther we got.
Okay.
And
To see from the little to the big.
we need the microscope to see from little things to the big picture.
Okay. All right. Very good. Very good.
I can't remember what we said. Well, faith certainly comes in handy, as someone said, when we can see what it is that we're talking about. It's okay, but there comes a time when you've got to stop and look a little closer. The microscope, of course, by that time, microscopes were the big thing.
Mm-hmm. Right? It kind of brings in maybe some of that, science versus religion stuff again. Who knows? Who's going here? Kathy?
I don't know if we have much to add. You've kind of all covered it. But we did think that when gentlemen can see, that sort of might reflect back on seeing as believing. Playing with that idea.
What do microscopes help us do there? Mary?
We agree with table one.
Agree with table one? Roger?
This is kind of a different interpretation. Faith is a fine invention, but in an emergency, you better turn to something more positive.
Something more positive.
More positive than your faith. You want something tangible.
Okay. So does that mean faith is inadequate in those times of emergency?
No, I didn't mean to interpret it that way.
So you have to look deeper. All right, back up here with this table. Yes?
I wonder if the editors took out an apostrophe T on the account.
No, I think we can find the manuscript. I think we got the manuscript right up here.
Sometimes something happens in your life.
Uh-huh.
And you go along and life was simple because you could believe, you had faith and you went to church and you did all those things. And then something comes along, something terrible happens in your life, catastrophic. And you think, why did God let this happen to me? And that's when I have to get out my microscope and say, He's still there. He's still in control.
So the microscope is an instrument for self-inspection,
Self-inspection.
as you see it, for self-inspection, okay?
It has seemed to me that in those terrible times, that seems to be the time that I'm teachable. I kind of like to be in control, but every now and then I have to go through really deep waters to know where my strength is. And maybe that's the times that I have been most teachable, I think, in those emergencies.
Well, very good. Thank you so much for, I really like the idea of the microscope as, reading the microscope as something for self-inspection, for looking deeper and more closely into oneself. Did anybody address the quotation marks around faith at your table? Yeah. Why do you think those quotation marks are there?
So-called
So-called faith. Yeah. Okay. Uh-huh. So when everything's
Everybody asks you yes.
yeah.
But do you?
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Calls into question. Yeah. Calls it into question there. There's also the possibility, all right, and I just throw this out, there's also the possibility that this is really a pretty cynical poem. And that this, microscopes are simply for seeing. And one of the things that she said over and over, right, is that we're not going to see concrete evidence of God. Nothing that we can see is ever going to change our opinions and change our minds or give us that proof. And so it might be that she's just talking about the futility of the entire process of looking for evidence for God. Yeah. That makes it a pretty cynical poem. Okay, we are over time. I only had the one last poem here. And I put it there because it draws a lot of things together. If you're willing to hang with me another 2 minutes or so, we'll read it and close with this. Here's it. The brain is wider than the sky, for put them side by side, the one the other will contain with ease, and you beside. The brain is deeper than the sea, for hold them blue to blue, the one the other will absorb as sponges buckets do. The brain is just the weight of God, for heft them pound for pound, and they will differ, if they do, as syllable from sound. First of all, that says a lot about the incredible abilities of the human mind, right? I mean, all of this vast expanse and depth that the human mind can take in, wider than the sky, deeper than the sea. I love that little comparison there, that little metaphor. The one the other will absorb as sponges buckets do. The brain is like a sponge that you can drop in a bucket and it just sucks up all the water. It sucks up all the knowledge, everything that there is to know. The brain's capable of that. But finally, the brain is just the weight of God. For heft them pound for pound, and they will differ, if they do, as syllable from sound. So there's that conditional there, that if. Is she saying there isn't any difference between the human mind and God?
She says if they do.
If they do, right? So it's conditional. If they differ, right? She's not if, but she's not committing herself one way or the other, right? If they differ, all right? They will differ as syllable from sound. That seems to be pretty much the same, right? In what way? In what is it about human beings that capture the image of God? Is it that we're symmetrical beings with 2 eyes and 2 arms and 2 legs? Is that the image of God? Or is the image of God this incredible power of the human mind? And notice that she finishes with language. That maybe what captures, the incredible power of the divine, and where we have managed as little humble creatures to begin to capture God's image is through language. That's the kind of thing a poet would say, right? So, okay, thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the other poems. Yes. Yes.
I just want to remember, some people will remember the time that Carlene Tyler did a whole theater production as Emily Dickinson.
Yeah.
And what a terrific job it was, she said, because often you get your cues from somebody else's line, but here you are, and you just have to go on your own.
Right. Yeah. Carlene and I actually put together a convocation where she would do a short scene from the play, and then I threw in a few little lecture-y type things, and we went back and forth, and it was really great fun. In fact, I joked with her earlier this week if she wanted to come back and recreate Emily, and we'd go and take our show on the road again. But she thought that was a pretty tall order. So, yeah. Any other questions that people have?
What drew you to this, and what did you do for your dissertation with this information, with Emily? What did you prove or figure out?
I've always been drawn to writers who are primarily interested in religious themes, religious ideas, and the spirituality of human beings. So whether it's Melville or Emerson or Whitman, I mean, those, and these are 19th century American writers, of course, but you take, I mean, across the globe, Dostoevsky or somebody, those the people who are really interested in those crucial questions of human life that have always intrigued me. And so Dickinson just had an immediate appeal to me. For my dissertation, I actually did my dissertation on the manuscript booklets themselves. The manuscript booklets were put together for the first time by this Ralph W. Franklin character in 1982. And there had been speculation for 2 decades before that. I mean, we all knew that that was the way that she had recorded most of her poetry, that she ended up copying them into these little manuscript books. And so there had been speculation that those little booklets were actually poetic sequences, that she had bound them, very intentionally in a particular order so that they weren't just individual lyrics, discrete individual lyrics, but rather, meaningful artistic sequences of poems. When Franklin finally succeeded in putting them together, because what happened, of course, those booklets were immediately started to be torn apart in the editing process in 1890, 1891. And the sheets and the leaves all got dispersed in all different directions. So it was a 100-year process just bringing all of those back together and getting them back together in the right order. So it seemed pretty clear to me. I was taking a textual bibliography course at Kansas State under one of the world's best textual bibliographers, a guy by the name of George Kaiser. And it looked really clear to me that there was physical evidence in the manuscript booklets that would suggest that these were not poetic sequences. They weren't intended, she wasn't trying to copy poems in some kind of meaningful artistic sequence. And so it was largely, maybe here's the irony, we're talking about microscopes and so on, and the kind of physical evidence that you can see to put things together. It really wasn't so much a reading of the meaning of the poems as it was a study of the physical qualities and characteristics of the manuscript booklets themselves. And so, my thesis was that I called them poetic scrapbooks, that there were certain subjects perhaps that guided her in putting them together, but they couldn't be meaningful sequences because she had a very distinct pattern of copying the longer poems on the first page of her little 4-page folded sheet, and then when she had space at the bottom, she'd fit shorter poems in. Well, when you take that pattern over and over and over again, you document it, it certainly suggests that she's simply copying poems to space. The same way we put a scrapbook together. We've got room for this picture here, and it's all our, it's our pictures of our summer vacation, right? They're all pictures of our summer vacation, but we put things where we have space for them and not particularly in any meaningful sequence. So that was my thesis. So, any other? Okay. All right.
Is it known how much she read and what she read and how this might have influenced her in any way?
Well, she said her only companion was her lexicon. All right, so she was a huge dictionary person, and one of the really a valuable, one piece of valuable assistance I had during my dissertation was that a woman out at the University of Utah had a copy, a very rare, the Webster's dictionary that they had in the Dickinson home was actually a very rare one. And so she had access to it, and when I had particular questions about what's the definition that Dickinson would have had for this word in her dictionary, she would send that to me. So, but no, we know that she read voluminously. She was a particular fan of female British writers. So Elizabeth Barrett Browning. She's a big fan of Browning. In fact, she's got a couple of poems in which she writes about Browning, the Bronte sisters, and others. Shakespeare, she knows her Shakespeare, and she knows her Bible forwards and backwards.
Have you been to her home?
I have not.
And where is it?
It's in Amherst, Massachusetts. Amherst, Massachusetts. Yeah, and there's the old family home where she and Lavinia lived out their lives, and then Austin, the brother, built a house next door called the Evergreens. The original home is called the Homestead, and the Evergreens house is right next door, and it's all a part of the Emily Dickinson Museum now. Yeah.
What would you say is maybe a very familiar poem that we would know other than these?
Because I Could Not Stop for Death is probably the most famous Emily Dickinson poem. Yeah, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. All right, thanks again. If you want to see the manuscript books, I brought my facsimiles.